Welcome to Scoop, where you get the scoop on this week's news. My name is Jenna, and this is Smarter News. Hello, everyone. It's great to see you on the final Monday of July. I was just thinking about this expression of making it until the end of the month. Like you made it. You made it to the end of July. We don't want to just make it. We want to thrive. We want to thrive through July and head into August in great position. However, I will tell you, I was a little bit relieved this week at least this weekend, when I saw that there was no earth-shattering breaking news. There's always a little bit of news somewhere. There's always a little bit of controversy somewhere, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But to not see a breaking news headline as we have seen in the last couple of weekends was a little bit of a relief. That's a wooden desk, and I'm knocking because let's not get ahead of ourselves. It's still early on Monday, and the whole point of Scoop is to get you ready for the week ahead. And we have a couple really interesting stories that are percolating. We're obviously watching the Olympics, which is an event that only takes place every couple of years. So it gives us something to look forward to. It gives us something new that we don't see all the time. Of course, there was a little bit of controversy with the Olympics this weekend, and we have some activity coming from the White House to watch. We have some activity coming from the campaign trails to watch. And so there's a lot of sort of a assortment of news. And going back to the mission of Smarter News, is quick, concise, nonpartisan news, but it's small bites of high quality information. And that's really what we're going to do today. A lot of small bites, high quality information, hopefully get you started. If we have more questions, we can address them. But one of the themes that came out, I was struggling for a theme this week, and one of my colleagues was like, "Do you see a theme?" I'm like, "I see nothing." I see nothing from the news this week. The last couple of weeks of news have been driven by a very specific breaking news item. And it can almost be more difficult when you're like, what is actually the driving force of the news? And I was like, I don't see a theme. And then I thought to myself, well, what is actually one of the most interesting stories that I've read? And usually it's something that's not at the top of everybody's broadcast, but it can get me started. I'm like, well, I think the story about the Seine River is actually the most interesting. It's about sewage. And I said, that's it. That's the theme. Cleanup. We're going to do some cleanup this week. We're going to clean up a little bit of the lingering stories that are out there. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to start this week. We're going to talk a little bit about cleanup. We're going to clean up a few of the different lingering storylines out there, get them to a good position. And of course, these are still developing storylines. But let's talk a little bit about the Olympics, because we had the opening ceremony this weekend, and we have competition actively underway. It's a time where you see the world come together in an effort of sportsmanship and competitiveness. And it's a moment where we also get to experience so many new stories, triumphs, as well as trials for people, and really get to observe human nature and root for our country. It's something that we could do across political lines. And what a great time to do it at this particular year where we're talking about the election. There's a couple of things that I want to mention about the Olympics. And one of them is a news story that we're starting off the week with. In fact, I have some video from a recent trip to Paris that I wanted to share with you just for a second here. And it's a close-up you'll see of the Seine River that runs right through the heart of Paris. It was used in the opening ceremonies where you had the boats carrying different teams from different countries down the Seine. This is a really important waterway, by the way. It's not just a tourist area where you're doing, dinner sailing across the Seine, although you can definitely do it. It's also really important for commerce. It's been important for Paris for hundreds of years. So it's a really important waterway. There's been a lot of debate about this waterway, though, this particular river, because Paris wanted the different events to take place in the river, but the river has not been clean. In fact, for years, 100 years, in fact, you have not been legally allowed to swim in the Seine. I believe the date was 1923 when swimming was banned. Although I've seen some photos in the past of people swimming, in the 1940s, for example. So I don't know how much it was enforced, but it's been widely understood that this is not a clean river. And part of the issue is the way that sewage has been managed in the country. And so, because a lot of different, it's not just Paris, you're talking about the towns and the cities along the Seine all the way to the coast. So this has been a big issue. And just recently, the mayor of Paris jumped in the Seine River and was swimming and saying, it's going to be clean for the Olympics. And it seemed like things were going to be moving in the right direction. There was one caveat to this, and that was rain. If there is a heavy rain, it may be a problem. And guess what happened on Friday, Saturday of this past weekend was an all out downpour in Paris that really affected the opening ceremonies as well. And that rain has now affected the water quality in the Seine. It was debatable going into it, but the rain has now made it quote unquote unsafe to swim in the Seine. The triathletes that we're going to get, there's some practicing that you're able to do, kind of check things out, right? Just sort of like the gymnasts go in and they kind of work on, the balance beam a little bit before their major competition. This was going to take place for the triathletes, and the triathletes haven't been allowed to do this. And tomorrow they'll make a call whether or not the triathletes are going to be able to swim. The likelihood is they're going to delay them for a few days. And if they can't if it doesn't work out in the next couple of days, the triathletes, which is swim, bike, run, will not be able to swim. So think about that. You've been training for years, and it will become a bike run event rather than a swim, bike, run event. Can you imagine that? In some of the other sports, and I don't have all of them in front of me that would be using the Seine, there's other ways around it. They have backup plans. In this case, they don't. And it's been $1 billion that Paris has invested to try to clean this up. And it's been an effort going on for several years now. So just keep that in mind. You're going to see a lot of that in the pictures and, the big overview shots of Paris during the competition, during the Olympics. And so this is kind of at the heart of the city, all along the historic areas that everybody sees: the Eiffel Tower, the Louvre, Notre Dame. And there's a big question mark about what's going to happen. So I'm sort of devastated for these athletes. I did one triathlon. Ironically, it's called an Olympic triathlon, although I am not an Olympic athlete, but it has to do with the certain distance that you swim. And the swim was so terrible for me. I've never done an open water swim. My husband surprised me during our first year of marriage by signing me up, surprise, for a triathlon. I would highly suggest against that for all romantic couples out there. It could sound like fun, but it could also cause your spouse a great amount of stress, which it did for me. I ended up enjoying it, but I think it was just relief that it was over. And I'm sort of a one and done. If you did it like a triathlon, I'm done. Like you did a marathon, I'm done. I don't know if I need to do 25 of them. Some people love to do that. That's not me. So I feel like especially with the folks that really are depending on a swim and a triathlon to get them into this particular standing, this would be really devastating. So just a little side story when it comes to the Olympics that actually is not even a side story anymore. I think it's actually going to become more of a central story. I got a great question from the audience, an audience member here at Smarter News about the Olympics. And this is in the aftermath of an opening ceremony that ignited quite a bit of controversy, quite frankly, around the world for some of the scenes that were depicted. We're not going to go into all of them. I know some of you also have this podcaster's video on when you're around your family. And I was watching the opening ceremony with my family. My eldest is 9 years old, 9, 8, and 5, just turned 5 last week. So this is the age of my kids. And in general, when I'm thinking about Smarter News, I like to use language that's appropriate for the entire family because so much of what we're consuming is not appropriate for the entire family. So I really try to do that. So in just, general terms, there were different parts of this opening ceremony that ignited some controversy about how they were produced, what they were suggesting along the lines of gender, sexuality, that sort of thing. And in the aftermath of this, the organizer, the main director or choreographer of the event, has come out and said what some interpreted as a flippant reaction to Christianity, as some did based on some of the scenes that were portrayed. He said it had nothing to do with that he was not referencing anything biblical at the time. This is just one portion of the controversy, by the way, because it's not just about these different topics. It's how these different scenes played out. And if they looked at like scenes of famous art that was depicting the Bible, I mean, there was a lot of different layers here. Let's just be frank. So what you should know is that the French director is denying this and says they're, in general, the officials are saying they're very sorry if anyone was offended by this, but that's not what they intended. In any event, it's done and over. The controversy is still sort of lingering a little bit, but we're not going to see another opening ceremony. So the question was from the audience, was who pays for this? Like, who actually pays for the Olympics? It's actually a great question. It turns out it's much more difficult to figure this out than we realized. And one of the things I think taking away from our research that I think is important is the International Olympic Committee is actually a nonprofit. So it's self-funded, and it's self-funded in a few different ways. There's donations, there's certain sponsorships. It basically raises its money in a private fashion, but it's a nonprofit. And the host city of a country is really responsible for footing a great amount of the money that goes into hosting the Olympic Games. The flip side for a host city is that they get international exposure and they get a lot of tourists that come. There's business and commerce that comes to the area. I'll tell you, when I was in French, the French folks that we talked to, and I talked to quite a few of them, just how do you feel about the Olympics? Many of them were very frustrated already because they felt that the French people were put as second class citizens to the tourists that were coming in, and they didn't like that feeling. That was, again, I talked to a handful of people, but that was some of the feelings that we got. Here's an example about how different the funding is versus the International Olympic Committee and what they contribute to an Olympics and what a host city contributes to the Olympics. So in Tokyo, in 2020, it was about 1.7, $1.8 billion that the International Olympic Committee contributed. And then the city actually committed $13 billion. So think about that. It's a totally different, uh, completely uh, disproportionate. So what the International Olympic Committee sounds like a lot of money, but it's disproportionate to the host city. And many times the host city isn't able to make back the money that they're investing in this event in a way. In recent years audits that would reflect that. It's hard to say, well, did someone see Paris in the Olympic Games in 2024 and then decided to host their wedding there, 12 years later, and that brought an economic stimulus to the city that wouldn't otherwise be there. It can be hard to quantify some of those things, but it gives you an idea of who's actually the main provider of funding. It's easy to think about the Olympics sort of like the United Nations. Well, everybody must contribute something from all these different countries, but that's not exactly the way that it's done. In fact, it's not done that way at all. It's really about the host city and the nonprofit International Olympic Committee, and then all these different ways that they're able to raise money or collect money, including the television and broadcasting rights. One other thing I thought was important to mention to you is that you may see an athlete with an AIN, which stands for, and it's a little bit backwards because I'm translating French to English, the individual neutral athletes. These are athletes that are participating with Russian or Belarusian or for Belarus backgrounds. And Russia and Belarus have been banned from participating in the games because of a series of different scandals, and not in and with including the war in Ukraine. There's a lot of different reasons why the Russian athletes and Russia hasn't been allowed to participate in an official capacity in many years. So if you see an athlete or a commentator says something about it being a Russian athlete, they're not going to be participating on behalf of Russia, even though they are Russian. They are going to be in this category, individual neutral athletes. And what's also interesting about this, so let's say they get to the podium and they win a gold. We don't even know what song is going to be played. It's a especially composed music that's not referencing any sort of country at all, and is not going to have it's not going to resonate at all with the background of Russia or Belarus. So we know in the past, the Russian athletes have been highly competitive. So you may see that. And I thought that was something good to equip you with, but you won't see their flag. You won't hear their anthem. They may be referred to as a Russian athlete, but if they're not participating officially as part of Russia. So why does the International Olympic Committee allow them to compete at all? Why are they even allowed? Well, the Olympic Committee, in essence, is saying they want athletes that are able to work hard and follow the rules of the committee to have a way to compete. They don't want to punish the athletes because of the country. And so that's how this takes place. Pretty interesting, isn't it? This is the backdrop of the Olympics in an election year for the United States, but also, as we know, a major election year around the world. It's such an interesting timing because we have a place, one major city, which is Paris, where the entire world is not only focused, but you see vastly different people with a lot of different backgrounds living in close quarters together, competing together, and working towards a goal that is lofty, obviously getting a gold medal. But in the grand scheme of things, it's still an athletic competition. I'm an athlete, you may be an athlete, it still matters, but, as far as the stakes of, life or death, what we're talking about a lot in the news, for example, in war, it's different than that. And so the background of the Olympics when we're watching a lot of different developing stories is a bit refreshing. So hopefully we have those great stories that come out of personal triumphs and people overcoming trials. And hopefully the Seine River is clean and we're able to see a great competition. We have seen a few different disruptions of the rail lines going into Paris. This morning there was a disruption with telecommunications around the city. So we're going to watch the security situation as well. Just because the first couple days have been underway relatively uneventful, I also think this is an important story to watch as far as security. A couple other stories just around the world, just thinking about here's a time of unity for the the global community. But we still have some different conflicts we want to keep an eye on. We're still watching what's happening between Russia and Ukraine. We're still watching what's happening between Israel and Hamas. So those are the two war fronts we're watching. This weekend, there was rockets that were fired from Lebanon, which is to the north of Israel, hit an area where young people were playing. 12 young people died. 20 others were injured in this attack. Lebanon is where Hezbollah, a designated terrorist group by the United States, exists. That terrorist group is sponsored by Iran. That's where that group is. The group denies having anything to do with this rocket attack. But if you hear from lawmakers, they're saying, no, this is absolutely Hezbollah. In the meantime, the fighting between Israel and Hamas, another Iranian backed terrorist organization, is taking place in Gaza. We just saw recently Israel being attacked by the Houthis, another designated terrorist group backed by Iran. So we want to keep an eye on the Middle East because this sort of escalation is something we have to pay attention to. The way the Associated Press was describing what happened in Israel with the 12 deaths, it was the most deaths that Israel has seen since the October 7th terrorist attack. So significant. And we're also watching the continuing death toll in Gaza as that's continuing to rise. And the international community continues to put pressure on Israel to change tactics or to think differently about this conflict. But there doesn't seem to be an end in sight. At the same time, while there's a focus on the Middle East and Eastern Europe, we also want to watch what's going on with China. And we have two of our cabinet officials, the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State in Japan today. There was a big announcement by America and Japan. We have a military footprint in Japan, a relatively big one, similarly to what we have in South Korea, in that these are the two major places that we have positions, but we do have positions across what's called the Indo-Pacific. And what the announcement came from America and Japan is that we're going to be increasing our footprint. The way that the Secretary of Defense, and maybe increasing is not the right term, we're going to raise it in profile. The Secretary of Defense said that the change that we're going to see is the most significant change to U.S. forces Japan since its creation and one of the strongest improvements in our military ties with Japan in 70 years. Basically, what they're doing is creating a joint forces, like a headquarters. The word that's being used is reconstituting our current position into a joint force headquarters. So that'll raise the status. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, but again, something that's happening that maybe not won't get the same attention that other news will get in your regular broadcast. So I wanted to make sure to flag that for you. Just last week, as the president was speaking in the Oval Office, telling the nation that he was going to no longer pursue the nomination for president from the Democratic Party, we also got news that there were some military jets, Chinese and Russian military jets, flying in an area that was getting closer to what we would consider our airspace. And NORAD, which is a joint operation between the United States and Canada, had to uh, intervene with these jets. Which I got a question about that. What does that mean when you have NORAD saying that they had to confront? And let me go ahead and pull this up for you because I want to use the exact language. It wasn't something I was planning on talking about today, but I think it's important that the term is intercepted. So, like, what does that mean? It can mean a few different things. Mainly, it's just to tell jets that are coming close, we see you. What are you up to? We think you should probably turn around. It could be a kind of a general term, but it certainly is something that has happened in the past. But the timing of it was interesting because it happened on the day of this very important address to the country. And it's a sign that China and Russia continue to work together. There's all sorts of reporting that's suggesting they're working together when it comes to Ukraine, that China is very key to Russia being able to maintain a certain pace of military engagement in Ukraine through whether it's business deals or actually through supplying weaponry. And so we're really watching that relationship really closely. When it comes to our Secretary of Defense and our Secretary of State being in Japan, this was the main topic of conversation. Well, what about China? What about how China is behaving in the region? How do we counteract that? One of the ways that we're looking to do that is a closer partnership or alliance with Japan and standing up a little bit different of a military position in this part of the world. It's remarkable to think about because World War II wasn't that long ago. Japan was an enemy of the United States, an enemy. This war was brutal. And it's a reminder when I see these, you talk about the alliance and the agreement between the two countries, it's always important. That was less than 100 years ago. And here we have a very key alliance now that's strategic for both countries. So it's a reminder in many ways that things can change. It's also a reminder that the world is big. And a lot of what we're going to be focusing on in the coming weeks are going to be focused on our domestic issues related to our election. And we always have to remember that one international incident can change the election completely and the sort of leadership that America is looking for. And so, as I move to talk a little bit more about domestic politics now and a little bit about the campaign trail, we have to keep that in mind. It takes one twist, then the story completely changes. And if something becomes, if the news cycle becomes more focused on foreign policy, how could that change the election? That's a good question to ask yourself about what you're looking for in American leaders. When we woke up this morning, we have some news coming from the White House. President Biden put an editorial in the Washington Post, and the editorial clarified some of what he discussed in his Oval Office address on Thursday. One of the things he said in his address when he mapped out what he'd like to do over the next 6 months is Supreme Court reform. And when he said that, it definitely perked up my ears because Supreme Court reform can mean a lot of different things. It can also be very controversial. For the last 100 plus years, the Supreme Court has had 9 justices. And before that, though, in America, the number of justices fluctuated. So when I hear Supreme Court reform, I wonder, is this going to be an effort to add justices to the court? Sometimes it's referred to as Supreme Court packing, and that could change the dynamics of the court. Because if, for example, you have a Democrat president and they would like to appoint a justice that's more aligned based on their rulings or their past decisions with Democratic policy agendas, then the court dynamics would change. But the fact that President Biden used such kind of a generic term, we didn't know exactly what he meant. And it could mean a lot of different things. So in this editorial, we actually got some clarification. Because that's the more controversial topic about the number of justices in the court, that's immediately where my mind went. Is that what's going on? This is a topic of conversation that's come up for years. Could we actually see a change like that? And it's come up, by the way, for Republicans and Democrats at different times. But recently it's come up more for Democrats because there are more quote unquote conservative judges that have been appointed to the court. So what did President Biden say in this editorial? He said that for Supreme Court reform, here's what he was talking about: term limits. He wants 18-year term limits. We didn't get a lot of specifics on why 18 years. I think that was an interesting choice, like 18 years. Where did it come from? I'm sure there's a good reason for it. We didn't get any clarification on that. But there would be a term limit. There would also be more of an enforceable ethics code. Right now, the Supreme Court justices, as the highest courts in the land, really are responsible for enforcement. So there some sort of mechanism where there'd be ethics enforcement of the court. And then he tucked into this editorial as well a constitutional amendment that would provide and clarify presidential immunity, which would say that presidential immunity for any crime doesn't exist. So this is a big editorial. I mean, this is a lot to read through. It's sweeping agenda items for a president. And there's a question about what's actually possible. The last thing the president writes in this particular piece is, in America, no one is above the law. In America, the people rule. And he's really trying to clarify why he's making this a priority. He thinks that because there's term limits for presidents, and by the way, that's something new that came up in the 1950s, there should be term limits for the Supreme Court. What he's calling the constitutional amendment, he's entitling it "No one is above the law" amendment. And I'm just going to read from here. It would make clear that there is no immunity for crimes a former president committed while in office. I share our founders' belief that the president's power is limited, not absolute. We are a nation of laws, not kings or dictators. But that's about all you get on it. So it's important to know that although you're going to hear a lot of this discussed, as far as his specifics, as to example, what would be the exact language of a constitutional amendment? We didn't get anything like that. The actual probability of any of this passing while he remains in office is very, very low. I never say never, but extremely low. I mean, just logistically, it would be very difficult to do any of this. But what President Biden is doing is he's mapping out priorities for himself and his legacy and stating what he wants. And quite frankly, he has very little downside for this. The only downside is that he probably doesn't want to hurt his now endorsed vice president for the ticket. He doesn't want to cast a shadow that could affect her. But in general, he can kind of say, this is what I want and this is why I want it. And if there's not a lot of specifics, it's very low. It's a low risk for him because he only has 6 months left in office. What he also is doing is setting a tone. And even though this could be improbable logistically, it also can start building momentum on these particular topics. So maybe you don't see term limits passed by the time President Biden leaves office for Supreme Court justices, but he has started the ball rolling. Could it come in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years? If the Democrats win the House of Representatives, if they win the Senate and they win the White House, they could have a lot of momentum for different legislative achievements. And so he's putting it out there into the universe. The momentum can start building. There can start being a conversation. We're going to cover it here on Smarter News. And this starts working towards a platform for Democrats. So wanted you to be aware of it. The president is traveling today to Austin. He's going to be talking about the Civil Rights Act, and he's going to be doing so at President Johnson's library. Now, President Biden is getting a lot of comparisons to President Johnson because President Johnson didn't run for re-election. He came into office, obviously, because of the assassination of JFK. So you're starting to see the president take some action to put some things into the political sphere that maybe wouldn't otherwise be there. And we'll see how that affects the election cycle of 2024. But I thought it was important that you knew that it took place. I wanted to have a moment to talk a little bit about the election of 2024 because there's a lot happening this week. And I would like to pull up, if I can, sort of the calendar of different events. And this was a good map for what we're going to see from the Democratic Party this week. This was mapped out last week when the Democrats had a major meeting. And just so you know, Saturday was actually an important day because Saturday at 6 p.m. Eastern was the last time a candidate could declare their intention to run for president. And Kamala Harris did that over the last several days. She did that obviously before the deadline. So no one else said that they're running. So she is the only one. And she is now going to be seeking delegate support. And we expect the virtual roll call for delegates to take place on Thursday. Basically by tomorrow, there is the move by the candidate, which is Kamala Harris, to get enough support, to try to get enough support to demonstrate they have a viability to be at the top of the ticket. And so they're going to need to prove, and this would have taken place in the convention too, that 300 delegates support them, at least 300 delegates support them, which she has. And so later this week, the expectation is we're going to have a virtual roll call, which is sort of like a big Zoom meeting. And these delegates are going to get together and they're going to officially select her as the nominee of the Democratic Party, but she's still not officially the nominee. Can anything happen between now and then? Sure. But the likelihood is she will be the nominee. What happens when a presidential candidate backs out for the Democrat Party specifically, and parties' rules can change, and they can often change too during a convention. There's nothing set in stone per se, but for the Democrats, the process is as follows: that if I was running for president and I decided no longer want the nomination, I was selected through a primary process of American voters. American voters choose me at the top of their ticket, And what that's really doing is saying the delegates from their state are going to select me officially at the convention. So it feels like we're casting the ballot for an actual candidate, but we're actually casting a ballot so our delegates will select them. That's how that's working. When a presidential nominee decides they do not want that nomination, then the delegates in the Democrat Party are free. They can do what they can choose whoever they want. They don't have to go back to voters. And there's been some talk about that of, well, this is illegal. They need to go back to voters. And this is not how it works. The delegates are actually able to independently make the selection, which is why this would be an interesting process if there were multiple candidates. But there's not right now. There's only one. And that's why the likelihood is that Kamala Harris will officially become the Democratic nominee for president by the end of this week. And then by next week, the way that the schedule would go is that she would select her vice president, and then you'd have the ticket in place by the time that the convention starts at the end of August. So this is the momentum building for Democrats. You're probably hearing a lot about polling and, what are different things saying now that you have Kamala Harris on the ticket, even though not officially, but on the ticket for voters in swing states and President Trump, and who's losing ground and who's gaining ground. Okay. Here, all of this is interesting if you're interested in polling. But remember, polling is backwards looking. It's a picture of the past. It's not a picture of the present, because as soon as I collect the data, it's old. If something big happens in the world, I didn't consider that in my polling data. The person I'm asking didn't know about an international incident or something that took place in their own life that would have affected their choice. So we have to be really careful about that. The momentum right now is certainly in the Democrats' favor because they have somebody new. Yes, she's the vice president, but she's new at the top of the ticket. There's a lot of energy. You're hearing a lot about fundraising and volunteer pacing and all of that. That is what's happening now. What we have to remember, just like I told you, after the Republican National Convention, there's going to be a lot of momentum for Republicans. That was quickly changed because President Biden made the decision to step away, and suddenly there was a focus on the Democrats. But there's going to be a momentum building. What I'm going to be watching for is not going to be the polling. What I'm going to watch for are live events. A lot of the events that Kamala Harris is doing right now are planned, prepared events in safe places, in places where she has support and rallies. I mean, President Trump's doing the same thing in friendly territory. But what we're going to be watching for is what happens when she sits down for a live interview. What happens during a live debate, if that indeed takes place? I know there's some friction about that from the two campaigns. What does that actually look like? That is also going to be really important. So right now we almost have the circle around her is really strong and tough, but it's going to be tested just like any political campaign and any political candidate is tested in the coming weeks. And so just be aware of that for your own sanity, because you could get lost in all these polls and what they say and what's the predictions of the future. So in order to give you a little sampling, though, I wanted to pull two voices, a Republican and a Democrat, to just share with you some of the talk of, how both sides are handling this. And I didn't want to flood you with a bunch of stuff, but I thought, let's just take two people. And we actually have two strong, different politicians, one Democrat, one Republican, both governors. Both have high profiles in their own party. Both of them and how they answer some of these questions made me laugh. So I hope they make you laugh too, because we need a little humor in this day and age, right? But I want you to hear how each party is handling some challenge now that the tickets are sort of coalescing. That suddenly we have a new person on the top of the Democrat ticket that's going to be likely official by the end of this week. How are the parties handling it? So the first person I want you to hear from is Governor J.B. Pritzker of Illinois. He's a Democrat. He has been talked about as potentially being a VP running mate. He wouldn't answer any questions on that, by the way. He was asked repeatedly about it. He won't answer any questions. But I want you to hear a little bit of how he's talking about Kamala Harris and what she means to the Democrat Party.
Our candidate is the Energizer Bunny. She's been everywhere all the time over the last several days, and we're excited about that, to get to see her in the battleground states and all over the country. And her message is one that I think resonates with people. One of those things, of course, is pointing out the differences between these two candidates. I mean, on the other side, they're just weird. I mean, they really are. The things that they stand for. Donald Trump, of course, is afraid of windmills, and he talks about all kinds of crazy stuff. His running mate, as you probably have heard, is getting known for his obsession with couches, and somebody who is hiding his views on a woman's right to choose. And then just broadly, the attack on people who are childless and saying that we had to raise taxes on childless people, calling them cat ladies. I think, he apologized to cats, but he hasn't apologized to women. Now, what does Kamala bring? I mean, first of all, I talked about the energy, but second, remember, this is a person who is a prosecutor. She's somebody who understands that making the case is how you win. That going out there and every day prosecuting the case, especially against a 34-time convicted felon and, frankly, a congenital liar, that's something that she's done in a courtroom. She's done it as Attorney General, and now she's doing it as a candidate for President of the United States.
I know the Democrats are getting the message out that you're trying to get out here as well. But when you talk to voters, it's the economy. I know inflation is down. I know you're going to talk about that, but people see grocery bills going up. They saw gas bills going up during the Biden-Harris administration. And then there was the disaster on the border. Again, that is improved, but that is something she is going to have to defend.
Well, I think what you're pointing to is the issue of affordability broadly, and that's something Democrats have been fighting for, making sure that we're bringing down the cost of goods at grocery stores. Kamala Harris and Joe Biden together have fought to bring down gas prices, have fought to bring down the cost of goods, and I've been amazed, actually, at the work that they've done.
And I want to look at immigration. She was supposed to get to the root of that problem. Did she? Are you pleased with what you did? Because you wanted more money there in Illinois. You wanted more federal money because of the number of migrants coming to your state.
Yeah, an enormous problem. And let me just say, we got left this problem by the former president, Donald Trump.
Okay, so that gives you a little bit of a sampling, doesn't it, of what's going on and how the Democrats are trying to answer some of these questions. So a lot of energy around the candidate. We didn't get a lot of specifics when it came to the economy, when it comes to the border. There's the border passing the blame to President Trump. Of course, he's going to pass it back to the Biden administration. There's a little bit of truth, by the way, in both of those assertions about the border numbers climbing and when they climbed during which administrations. But you could go back to the Obama administration, the Bush administration. We could go back as far as you want. We'll probably get into that on a later date, but you can see that there are going to be some issues that the Democrats are going to fine tune their message about. The economy is likely going to be one. The border is going to be another one. And you could see the way that he is talking about Kamala Harris, the energy she's bringing to the campaign, and also the fact that she's, able to be so many different places. The Energizer Bunny, I don't know if that's going to stick. I don't know if that's the reference that's going to stick, but that's the image that the Democrats are putting forward of saying, this is someone with a lot of energy that's going to reinvigorate our party. So let's hear from the Republicans. I cut about 3 minutes. I know these are longer sound bites, but I just want you to, if you can listen to 5-6 minutes of both sides, this pretty much sums up what everybody's saying all the time. So this way you could kind of turn the page. This is Chris Sununu. He is the Republican governor of New Hampshire, and he's picking up a question here about, well, what about the polling that's showing that Kamala Harris is making gains? So take a listen to him.
This is the honeymoon, right? I mean, this is the honeymoon period. They had the, if you will, the courage to push him off the ballot. Vice President Harris is in there. The media is fawning. Everyone's excited. It's a whole new race. That's all very true. And that's going to last for about 30 days. There's no question. I think the Democrats can take that momentum into the convention. The first poll, I believe, that will actually matter, if I may, is the Wednesday after Labor Day, right? So you're going to have this 30-day honeymoon period. Things will settle. Folks will get back, talk to their family and friends, come off a summer vacation, put their kids in school, all of that sort of stuff. And then they'll start really thinking about what this race really means. And you're going to get back to numbers you saw about a month before the original debate, which is essentially a neck-and-neck race, or at least within the margin of error. Probably Trump up by a little bit nationally. Some of the swing states all in play. And it's going to come back to issues. I think you brought up up this point very well with Governor Pritzker. The border issue, the inflation issue, these are still very real issues. It isn't just going to be about, well, we need to vote for Vice President Harris because she's a woman, or we need to vote for her because it's just a change and it's not Donald
Okay,
Trump.
but one of those issues
that doesn't carry.
One of those issues that you've already seen Kamala Harris address is former President Trump's 34 felony convictions. She is starting to frame her campaign as a prosecutor taking on a criminal. A Reuters Ipsos poll conducted after Trump was found guilty found that 1 in 4 independents said that Trump's conviction made them less likely to support him in November. Those are pretty serious numbers. Those aren't changing after Labor Day.
Well, I would disagree in that, I think a lot of us thought that the trials and the convictions would all have serious impact. They didn't. Look at the numbers before the debate. Trump was still winning. They have very little impact. And I would almost warn the Democrats.
It's the independents you need. Let me read it again. 1 in 4 independents said that Trump's conviction made them less likely to support him in November. You need all those votes if you're going to win.
Which means 3 and 4 don't care, Martha. That means 3 and 4 don't care. They care about the fact that they have record credit card debt. They see the border crisis out of control, and that falls directly on her and her administration. They see the migrant crisis, the homelessness crisis, the lawlessness crisis in this country. With all due respect to J.B. Pritzker, he can brag about Illinois and Chicago all he wants. Everyone's moving out of the Chicagos. 9 straight years of decreasing population for Chicago and Los Angeles and New York. And that's because of bad policy. So she's going to have to deal with policy. If you want to talk about January 6th, election denial and the trials, that's all been out there for America to absorb for the past 3 years, and it hasn't moved the numbers. You asked J.B. Pritzker, what's the best thing that Vice President Harris brings that Biden doesn't? He said she was a lawyer. If the best thing you have going for you is a lawyer going to Washington, nobody wants lawyers in Washington. That's the worst thing you can possibly be. And people want a change. They want some sort of disruption. They're tired of the elitism, the wokeism and elitism and the liberalism coming out of the country, telling people how to live their lives.
Governor,
they just want the freedom to live their lives.
I thought both of those sound bites gave you a really good idea of just the tone, the overall feeling from both parties. And you can see how both of them are being challenged on different issues and how we're going to have to come up with an explanation for how they are going to provide solutions. There is one point I wanted to mention, kind of wrapping back into, and listen, Governor Sununu calls it a honeymoon phase. That's the way he's using that term. Waiting to see how these polls shake out is a good idea for really anybody who of any political persuasion. I just don't happen to love polls as a way to offset my reporting. I much rather talk to you about it. The one thing I do want to mention for context is that President Trump and the Republicans obviously had an entire campaign around focusing on President Joe Biden. They're having to switch gears now. And there's been a question about, well, what does that now look like? How is the campaign going to sort out how they're going to talk about Kamala Harris? What are the attacks really going to look like? What's going to stick? Because they had a strategy in place. Now they're going to have to tear it up. And it's not they're going to have to start over. She was still on the ticket, but they're going to change. They're going to change some of what they were planning on doing. Kamala Harris and her team have already started to position her as that tough prosecutor going after a convicted felon who is President Trump. But remember what we have to watch in September, which is whether or not the judge in New York, who is responsible for the sentencing of President Trump on those felony counts related to the quote unquote hush money case, he is going to rule about whether or not when the sentencing is going to happen. And quite frankly, whether or not the verdict still stands because of the Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity. There is a chance, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen at all. Either this is the widely different expectations that could happen or possibilities. President Trump could actually be behind bars. We could actually see that mid-September. Or you could see the judge saying this case has to be retried, which means that his conviction would be thrown out, which would mean that he's no longer a convicted felon, which would mean that the Democrats had this attack in place on a convicted felon, but then they would have to change gears again. So there's this is what you got to let it all shake out a little bit. So this is a reminder, maybe focusing on the Olympics isn't such a bad idea right now because a lot can happen. That's just one scenario. I mean, think about how different the storyline is if you have a former president running for reelection behind bars or one whose conviction was overturned for any reason. I mean, those are just really different opponents that you're running against if you're the Democratic Party. So we'll see what takes place. And right now, I don't think there's any harm in touching in, touching out, like little quick touch points when it comes to politics, because a lot of these storylines need to mature and develop before we really understand what the Democrats and Republicans both say they have a platform, but what really is really sitting well with voters and what seems to be the motivating factors for this election. So we'll wait and see. All right, quick final thing before we go. I'm going to see if I could pull this up for you. There is some history being made at the Olympics, and it is the first time that we're seeing a purple track. So when you see track and field begin, you're going to see this purple track. You've never seen a purple track in the Olympics before. You may have seen something like it. Why is it purple? Well, first of all, it has to do with some of the theme colors for the Paris Olympics, which include purple, but also used in this track are ground up shells, like mussel shells from the ocean, like that sort of shell. Not like muscle, like it get confusing, like muscle and the athletes. No, like mussels, like shells from the sea creature or lake, I guess. You're going to challenge my muscle knowledge, but it's basically the shells that were going to be put into a landfill. They've actually repurposed some of these shells, and that's part of this ground up sand or sand-like substance, the composition that's in the track. And we'll see how athletes like the track. It's different. The color is different, but it's also a different innovation to making the actual track. So that's one of the firsts in the Olympics, which is a purple running track. And hopefully we also see some firsts, which are Olympic records being set on that track. But we'll see. And if there's no record set, then we'll blame the muscles. We'll blame the shells. Which will be better than blaming somebody else at this point, because there's enough blame to go around for everybody. So purple track, brand new. We'll watch that, and we'll watch the Seine River and the sewage there. See, we bookend the broadcast. We start with the Olympics, we end with the Olympics. Hopefully add some laughs in between. You feel ready for the week ahead. I saw one quick question I want to make sure to get before we leave. Lola was asking, Jenna, can you discuss the legality of Vice President Kamala Harris using the money President Biden raised before he dropped out of the presidential race? There's been some questions about the legality of that, but with Vice President Harris still on the ticket that she was on when the contributions were made, or before that, even if she wasn't on exactly when someone made a donation to President Biden, because she was on his ticket, then the money can more easily be transferred over to this new campaign. It's almost like it's a seamless campaign, even though she's pulling on someone else as her vice president nominee. And we'll see who that is going into next week. And we'll do more of a deep dive on who the potential people could be on that. Margie's asking, when will the next debate be? Will Robert Kennedy be included? Right now, Margie, the standards for the debates have all changed because now networks are hosting them rather than the Presidential Commission on Debates, which was an independent, nonpartisan nonprofit that was a part of it to try to set standards about who can make it on the stage. There was a standard as far as polling and also as far as how many different states' ballots you actually were on to qualify to be on the debate stage if we were still doing the debates the old way underneath this commission. Because it's now being hosted by networks in the agreement of the campaign, so they cut out this commission, they can basically set the rules however they want, which is the candidates could say, we'll participate, but it's only going to be two of us. Sorry. And so that's looking a little different. So the likelihood is he would not be included unless there's a big change. And he is someone interesting to talk about because he's made it onto more ballots for more states. So he could start being even more of a factor in the election if people are searching for an alternative or taking away votes from either side. So we'll watch for that. In the meantime, hopefully you guys enjoy the Olympics and enjoy a great start to August. We have a bunch of economic data this week to get, having to do with borrowing rates from the Fed and also a new jobs report on Friday. So all roads end up leading back to the economy and national security. So we'll continue to keep an eye on all of that for you. Sometimes looking at data 1 month off, by itself is not helpful, but we want to look as far as trends, and where we end up in the fall is going to be really important to voters, really for both political parties. So thank you for taking the time today, and we'll continue to join you for quick, concise, nonpartisan news throughout the week on our website and on social media and through our podcasting platforms. Thank you so much for your support of Smarter News. For those of you who joined us live, thank you. It's great to see you as always. And for those of you who are listening later, consider joining Scoop and joining us live, because I think you're going to very much enjoy it. You can go to scoop.smarternews.com, and it's a great way to support a free press and keep us totally independent. All right, guys, have a great week. We'll continue to watch this developing news and keep you posted as we hear more. In the meantime, have a wonderful time living out the story of your life, which is what we really want you to focus on rather than everybody else's story on Smarter News. All right, guys, have a great week. I'll talk to you soon. Bye. Thank you for believing in quick, concise, nonpartisan, Smarter News. Every time you join us or share or save our content, you help us build a solution in news, and we are so grateful. We have a few other ways you can support our mission, from joining our insider community Scoop, to shopping our gear at our Smarter shop, to just telling a friend. The best way to do any of this is to visit smarternews.com or follow us at Smarter News on social media. Don't worry, we put all of this in the captions so it's easy for you. Plus, we added our email just in case you want to drop us a note. We always love hearing from you. Thank you for helping us deliver news smarter.